The championship for a climate course is not a championship for the current generation, but it is for the future generation. It is an intergenerational struggle, it's an intergenerational succession, because the measures and the initiatives we take today might not be realized within one generation or one lifetime. And so the youth and the women, but more so the young people of this country, are the biggest gainers if we take positive measures and the biggest losers if we do nothing. Those who are affected by the adverse impacts of climate change tend to be those who are most vulnerable, and these are the youth and women. We want to ensure that this summit is not just a talking shop for presidents and ministers and members of parliament, and that there can be some synergy and linkages with the youth. I know there's going to be a youth summit that will be held just before the main summit, and we hope that that will bring together young people who can make a commitment on the measures that they must take to ensure that their children and the children of their children inherit a planet that is not too hot, inherit a planet that is not hostile. Women also bear the brunt of the climate crisis, and I've seen there are certain sessions that address the gender perspective as far as climate change is concerned. Ultimately, within the Kenyan context, we want this message to go to the lowest level possible. And I'm happy that the Senate and the Kenyan Parliament and the Kenyan government has approved the FLOCA program, which is about financing locally led climate actions, which is sending money to the 47 counties. There is almost 1 billion shillings that the Senate approved to go to counties in the last allocation of revenue act that the Senate passed. That money would be felt at the local level. The decisions and the solutions will be locally driven, and so it will not be about people in Nairobi or people sitting in Paris or people sitting in Washington deciding for the grassroots what they're supposed to do, but the grassroots people sitting themselves, the youth, the women, and people in the villages to decide what mitigation or what adaptation measures that they wish to take.
Yeah, maybe now, what would you add to the Kenyans in relation to promoting climate action?
We tend to talk of climate change or climate action, but I believe that the conversation should be about the climate crisis. Because when you just talk of climate change, it could be positive or negative change. But when you talk of crisis, then it brings out the reality. We have seen that crisis manifest itself. The last season, we saw a drought, we saw an infestation of locusts. All these are driven by changes in climate. We have seen rivers like Tana drying up. We have seen lakes like Lake Victoria and Lake Turkana also facing a lot of challenges. All that is driven by climate change. We must, as we aspire and as we fight for rights in this country, the political class has focused a lot on political rights. And after the last election, we went into economic rights. The fight for justice in this country should go beyond political, economic, social, and should now get into climate. Because if we do not deal with the climate crisis, then even the political, economic, and social justice that we expect will be compromised. The conflict in northern Kenya is a conflict over natural resources. And so you cannot tell them to have peace if they don't have water. The conflict in many parts of Africa, in the Sahel region, is a conflict of natural resources. You cannot preach political tolerance, economic prosperity, and social cohesion if you do not deal with the climate crisis. This thing is real, and if we do not take measures, it is going to create a future where our children will not have the benefits and the luxuries and the comforts that our current generation have had.
And about the amendments that you mentioned that are ongoing in the Senate right now, what are they seeking perhaps to improve or remove when it comes to carbon sequestration?
Carbon credit trading is an emerging area which can provide a lot of opportunities for developing nations, especially countries like ours that act as carbon sinks to get some money to continue pursuing the agenda of clean energy and clean climate growth. If you look at Kenya, 80% of our energy production is from renewables, hydro and geo and wind. If you look at Kenya, even though we have destroyed our forest cover, but we still have sinks. If you look at Kenya and its expansive territory, we are in a position to trade carbon in international markets, and we can use that money so that we do not beg for donor aid. We can use the carbon that we have. We can take advantage of the initiatives that we have put in place to have a clean and healthy environment, to get resources that can be used to address some of the social, economic, and political challenges that we have. We never had a legislative framework for carbon trading. We never had a legislative definition of carbon credit, carbon markets, and all those things around that particular industry. So this amendment that the Senate is processing today will provide a regulatory and a statutory framework that can allow Kenya as a country, private individuals, government entities to take advantage of the global carbon credits market. And it's a very lucrative market. There are things, for example, like the cost of a ton of carbon. If you don't have a proper framework, you will find that when you go to the international markets, and there was a study that said that Africa sometimes sells a ton of carbon at probably $10, while in Europe, you'll sell a ton of carbon at $700 or $800. So those disparities must be dealt with so that when Kenya takes carbon to the market, the same price that Europe gets in that market should prevail. I mean, if you look at it, it's almost like the oil industry. The oil industry, you've got the global price of a barrel of crude, but we've not had a global price of a ton of carbon. And that is part of what this amendment seeks to address.
Senator, you talked about Nairobi Declaration and the Africa Climate Summit. What will it entail?
It is a bit premature to predict because the presidents will start their dialogue on 4th and 5th. But we expect that at the end of it, they will make a declaration that will feed into COP28 later on in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. But I know that part of the conversation will be to restructure the global climate finance architecture. And perhaps that could entail empowering or merging some of the financing institutions within the climate space. I think there's been a concern that there have been many institutions with overlapping and duplicating roles. And perhaps it is time for Africa to have a focused way of climate financing. And part of it is what I've just talked about, also unlocking the carbon credits market, because that can also be another viable option for African countries to get finance to be able to deal with the climate crisis.
So my question is in relation to inclusion. We have the Africa Summit. Speaking in a position of a government official, what is the government doing so far to ensure that enough awareness is created to the people in the grassroots? Because you cannot have a conversation on climate change without involving the people involved. That's Kenyans and all that. So what's the government doing to make sure that enough information is shared so that we know what we are fighting?
As parliamentarians, we are doing what we are doing now, bringing together parliamentarians to have conversations. We have caucuses in parliament and caucuses right down to county assemblies that are aware of what is happening here. I might not be in a position to speak on behalf of the executive because as a member of parliament, I oversight the executive. I think we've got some concerns about this exercise being top heavy and not being a bottom-up exercise as it ought to be. But because this is the first high-level climate summit that we are hosting as Africa and Kenya is hosting as a country, perhaps we'll pick the lessons learned and adopt them going forward. But real climate action must be driven from the bottom up. It should not be a top-down thing. And I think once the summit is over, we in Parliament will be calling the government officials to do a post-mortem and see how effective this particular summit has been.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm moderating a session so that